Hi, everybody. My name is Stu Gilfillan. I'm the Director of Education for U.S. Sailing, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for today's Starboard Portal presentation. Today, we're focusing on an important topic in sailing, a really important one, which is cold water immersion, and we're lucky to have two outstanding presenters with us. First, if you're enjoying the Starboard Portal and any of the presentations we've done in the past, please support the efforts to build a community of active, engaged sailors by purchasing or renewing a U.S. Sailing membership. We've got a lot of great content that's coming up on the schedule, and thanks to U.S. Sailing members, we're able to adapt and evolve to better serve sailors with content like this. You can visit us at mem.ussailing.org to join or renew your U.S. Sailing membership today. And so our presenters today are two people that are absolute subject matter experts in this area. Rich Jepsen is the Vice President of U.S. Sailing's Board of Directors. Prior to joining the board, he served as U.S. Sailing's Training Committee Chair for 17 years and was the Commercial Committee Chair for 2. He's represented U.S. Sailing to the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators, which is NASBLA, the U.S. Coast Guard's National On-Water Standards Committee, and is a past member of the National Boating Safety Advisory Council to the U.S. Coast Guard. He's also a past member of the Board of Directors for the Alameda Community Sailing Center and was the CEO of OCSC Sailing, the premier sailing school in San Francisco Bay with 50 yachts, 1,100 members, and 70 employees. He's led over 30 commercial charter flotillas throughout the world and is an active racer on a variety of keelboats. Our other presenter is Robin Pope, who's the Chief Physician Assistant for Mountain Ear, Nose, and Throat located in the mountains of Western North Carolina. He has experience in emergency medicine, orthopedics, sports medicine, and is a fellow of the Academies of Wilderness Medicine. Prior to becoming a PA, he earned a Ph.D. in oceanography. In the process, he spent 2 field seasons in Antarctica working aboard ice-strengthened research vessels, giving him significant experience on truly cold water, and also somehow managing to make me feel like a complete underachiever. His experience as a boating instructor started in college when he taught sailing in Rhode Island. After moving to North Carolina for graduate school, he started whitewater paddling and is now an instructor trainer for the American Canoe Association in both whitewater, kayak, and swiftwater rescue. In that role, he's worked independently with a number of clubs, camps, and college programs. Currently, he's the chair of ACA's Board of Directors and secretary of their Safety and Rescue Committee. He's a member of the National Boating Safety Advisory Committee, a branch chief for the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary's OXPAD on-water paddling program, and is the paddle sports advisor for Sea Scouts. His work in medicine, boating education, and boating-related public policy all drive him to focus on preventing boating-related health issues. And his overall goal while working in boating policy is to use research and expert experience to develop evidence-based methods to improve boating safety. As you can tell, these guys know their stuff. We're really fortunate to have them. And with that, I want to thank you both. And Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Right. Stu, thank you very much. So our topic today is cold water immersion. And we're going to ask first, why should we worry about cold water immersion? And then the reality is that it causes an increased risk of rapid drowning, but that risk is preventable. It's preventable because in the medical literature, it's relatively well understood, but unfortunately, there are few boaters that are aware of the full extent of the problem. So we want to make sure that boaters are aware of it so that they can properly prepare for cold water immersion in order to manage the issue. So in today's talk, we're going to talk about some popular beliefs versus reality. We're going to define cold water, talk about 4 different types of cold water immersion problems, look at some methods to mitigate each type of problem, and then some implications for individual boaters and boating programs, and then wrap up with some opportunity for questions. So some popular beliefs that are out there in the boating community and the aquatics community. First is that hypothermia is the major risk in cold water immersion, and by the end of this talk, you probably will not believe that. There's a belief that you'll die of hypothermia in a few minutes if you fall into cold water. And that's something that I was taught decades ago when I was first certified as a lifeguard. It's what I was taught when I was first certified as a sailing instructor. And the reality is that that's not a true belief. At the same time, I've been taught that you don't need a wetsuit or a dry suit unless the combined air and water temperature are 120 degrees Fahrenheit or less, what's called the 120 rule. We'll talk about why that rule came into existence and why it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. And then the final thing that people believe is that cold water is really cold. So certainly when I worked in Antarctica and the water temperature was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, that was cold, but it doesn't have to be that cold to be cold. So the reality is that there are several major cold water immersion problems, and hypothermia is probably not the first one we need to worry about, because most cold water deaths are not due to hypothermia. There's evidence that there's several other things that lead to it before you become hypothermic. And the reason for that is even in ice water, loss of consciousness due to hypothermia takes time. It doesn't happen instantly. It takes 10, 15, 20 minutes for that to occur. I mentioned the 120 rule, and that rule really makes no sense. It says that if it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit out, we don't need any thermal protection if we are belly flopping on ice. I'm not willing to do that. I don't know anybody that is. And the 120 rule itself actually came, we believe, from an environment where the water temperature was steady, and it was more a discussion of the air temperature than the changing water temperature. So it made sense for that specific environment, but isn't widely applicable. And then the final thing is that cold water is not very cold. So let's talk about how cold is cold water. Olympic swimming pools are required to be between 78 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you've spent any time in just a bathing suit in an Olympic pool, not swimming around, you know that that's comfortable for a while, but after prolonged exposure, you start to shiver and feel cold. If water gets a little bit colder than that, it's when we start defining it as cold for immersion. And in medical research, 70 degrees Fahrenheit is considered the cutoff for cold water. The reason for that is if I go outside in shorts and a t-shirt right now when it's about 70 out, I'm pretty comfortable. But as soon as I get into water, the water conducts heat away from me. Motion of the water can cause heat loss by convection, and you cool off much, much faster. And we said 70 degrees Fahrenheit is the cutoff for cold water, but clearly as the temperature decreases, the risk increases. The risk at 40 degrees Fahrenheit is much higher than the risk at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But cold water can be immediately life-threatening unless you're prepared for it. And part of what we'll do today is talk about how to prepare for it. This next slide is an example of some people that were well prepared for cold water. This is a swiftwater rescue instructor class. About 10 people spent 3 days swimming in a local river. You can tell looking at the slide that it's a gray, cloudy, overcast, rainy day. Air temperature was about 45 degrees and water temperature was about 45 degrees. And despite that, everybody in the class was able to get in and out of the water, swim, not have any problems, and never complain of being cold, because if you look at all of them, they're wearing dry suits, and those dry suits had lots of insulation underneath them. So they were well prepared, and if we're going to go into the water, we want to be as well prepared as these folks were. So there are 4 different types of cold water immersion conditions that we can think about. Cold water immersion syndromes are just the adverse effects of the body upon exposure to cold water, and they include the cold shock response, cold incapacitation, hypothermia, and circumrescue collapse. And we'll go through each of those. So the cold shock response is also called cold shock or cold water shock, and it's an immediate reflexive response that typically lasts 1 to 5 minutes. The colder the water, the higher risk it is of occurring, and we believe from research that it rapidly reaches its maximum effect. So if you don't have an effect at, say, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that doesn't mean you're not going to be having a significant effect if the water gets a couple degrees colder. You can think of this more of stepping off a cliff than going down a gradual slope. The physical responses are pretty impressive. As soon as someone is exposed to cold water, they typically suddenly gasp. Their breathing rate increases dramatically, sometimes as much as 10 times the normal. Their blood pressure and their pulse elevate quite a bit. And if you've ever stuck your hand in ice water, you know it hurts. So they are often in a lot of pain. And that combination of the gasping, pain, elevated pulse, and blood pressure can lead to panic and a loss of coordinated motion.
Robin, do you mind if I ask a question?
No, sir.
Is there any way to prevent or reduce those effects, because they seem pretty daunting by themselves?
They are quite daunting. And there are some things that research shows that we can do and experience does. First, we know that this response is based on how rapidly you're exposed to cold water. Sudden changes in skin temperature appear to be what cause it. So if you can gradually and slowly enter the water, say sitting on the side of a pool and gently sliding in, getting only parts of your body exposed at a time. If you can avoid exposing your face to the water, that seems to decrease it. And then making sure that you're dressed properly so get in the water, your skin isn't cooling down. There is also some data that shows that prior exposure can reduce the effect, and essentially that's a training effect. It may be part of a physical response. It may be part also just knowing what's coming up gives you a better ability to handle it. But with all of those, the best way to deal with it is to avoid it and make sure you're not exposed to the cold water. If you make it through the cold shock response, then you'll be in the water. Typically, your breathing rate will slow down, your pulse will slow down, and you'll be able to do some things. While that's happening, your extremities are going to cool and start losing function. Typically, people start losing fine muscle coordination first, so they lose the ability to use their fingers or to grip things. That might be important if you're in the water and you want to activate a personal locator beacon or use a radio to call for help. It's probably something to do very quickly before you lose that fine motor coordination. As the extremities continue to cool, then people start to lose gross muscle coordination and lose the ability to swim or climb on or hold on to things. In very cold water, 40 degrees or colder, this can happen as little as 10 minutes. It may take 10 or 15 minutes in water as warm as 50 or 60 degrees because part of this depends on how you're dressed, how much body fat you have, and your previous exposure, how cold you are when you get into the water. One of the important things to remember here is that as your muscles cool off and you're no longer able to use them, if you don't have flotation, if you're not out of the water or suspended in the water with a life jacket, then you're no longer going to be able to swim and you will sink and drown. So this is a significant potential contributor to drowning.
That's great, Robin. Can you talk a little bit about when you do aspirate water, whether it's from the gas reflex or from loss of muscle coordination or being unable to keep your airway clear, what's it do to your buoyancy? Is that a thing?
That's a good question, and it really depends on how much you aspirate. You can start having trouble from aspiration with as little as 2 milliliters of water per kilogram of body weight. So an 80-kilogram person inhaling 160 milligrams of water, which is or milliliters of water, I'm sorry, that's not a whole lot. 160 milliliters is less than a soda bottle. So inhaling that much can cause difficulty breathing, but it is unlikely to affect buoyancy. At the same time, if you inhale water at any amount, it's going to displace the air that's in your lungs, and it's certainly not going to have a positive effect on your buoyancy. So if you make it through cold shock response and cold incapacitation and you stay in the water, your body temperature is going to continue to drop and you'll become hypothermic. And the reality is, if you become hypothermic due to cold water exposure, you've done some things right. You had to have on a life jacket to keep you afloat, because if you didn't, you would have slid beneath the water. Hypothermia is defined as a core body temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit or less, and that's great in a research or a medical environment, but we don't generally check temperatures in the field. We just look at how people are responding. So mild hypothermia, people typically are shivering, they have decreased physical ability, and unfortunately they have decreased mental ability, including worsening judgment. That's an issue because when you're in the water, you're in a survival situation, we hope that your mental capacities are at their peak, and we know that hypothermia is going to keep that from happening. At the time when you need the best possible judgment, your judgment is going downhill. As the body continues to cool, initially you were shivering, but muscles stop working and shivering below about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so the shivering will stop, and subjects become lethargic or unconscious. And then in severe hypothermia, subjects are going to be unconscious, their vital signs are going to be reduced or very difficult to find, even absent. They're going to be subject to spontaneous heart dysrhythmias and eventually death due to cooling of the body.
Robin, I've heard of the 1-10-1 rule, but heard criticism that it may be too simple and falls short of providing enough data to keep us safe. What can you tell me about it?
Sure. The 1-10-1 rule is a rule developed by Dr. Gordon Geisbrecht, who is one of the world's leading experts on cold water exposure. He has a number of videos out through Cold Water Boot Camp and beyond Cold Water Boot Camp, and he really is the guru to go to and ask questions about this. The 1-10-1 rule says that when someone is exposed to cold water, immersed in cold water, typically they'll have a minute or so of cold shock response with gasping and panic, and their goal then is to just control that. After that gets under control, they'll have on the order of 10 minutes to take care of critical things that need to be done, critical survival behaviors. And then after that 10-minute time frame, they're going to lose the ability to swim or to self-rescue. But they'll have up to an hour before they become unconscious, and in some cases much longer than that. The 1-10-1 rule is a model, and if you use it as a model to give some general guidelines about what to expect, it's outstanding. If you use it as a strict time frame that when you enter cold water, you will have absolutely 1 minute of cold shock response followed by cold incapacitation at 10 minutes and unconsciousness at an hour, it's not accurate. So I think it's a great rule when it's used as it was intended, and if you try to over-apply it, it may be disappointing. So the last thing that we see is called circumrescue collapse, and that literally means collapse around the time of rescue. Subjects that have this can do anything from fainting to going into cardiac arrest and having their heart stopped. We believe that it's associated potentially with decreased stress hormone production, so someone gets to shore, they get rescued, and they no longer have that survival mode that's driving them forward. There's also a suggestion that if the subject is upright in the water, the way they would float if they were in a life jacket, that the pressure of the water on their legs is helping support their blood pressure, and when you suddenly take them out of that water, the loss of blood pressure allows the blood in the core to go out to the extremities, drops their blood pressure, and causes problems. Certainly, if we're out on a sailboat, we're out paddling, we're not worried about measuring their blood pressure while they're in a dry suit. We're not worried about measuring their cortisol and epinephrine levels, but we do want to be prepared for them to lose consciousness. So the rule is that if we take this subject from the water, we want to be very, very gentle with them. We want to avoid letting them do much if they're not fully conscious. And we generally want to keep them as horizontal as possible. And then once we have them out of the water, we want to warm them based on current medical guidelines. And that means you should go out and take a wilderness first aid course and learn how to take care of patients that have hypothermia and other cold-related illnesses. So let's look at those components and think about what happens when we fall in cold water and what do we want to do about it. When we fall in, the first thing that will happen is a cold shock response. And our goal is to get our head above water, keep it there as well as possible. So if you're underwater, swim up to the surface quickly, focus on staying afloat. You are going to be panicked if the water is cold, so focus on your breathing, control the breathing, and reduce panic, and focus on getting your body under control so you can move on to the next step. All of this is going to be dramatically easier if you have a life jacket on, because if you don't have a life jacket, when you hit the water, you take your first gasp underwater, and you have trouble swimming, you take your second gasp underwater, and you have more trouble swimming, and potentially you're not able to take a third gasp at that point.
Robin, is that gasp reflex, is it more likely when there's a large differential between air and water temperatures? Is this something that is more about us than it is about the water?
So there are times when that's definitely true. And the greater the difference between air temperature and water temperature, the more likely this is to occur, just because it says that the water is going to be colder. But there have been some reports of it happening in even relatively warm water, 70 Fahrenheit or warmer, in very hot environments. An example are cases on places like Lake Havasu in Arizona, where the water temperature might be 70 Fahrenheit, 75 Fahrenheit, where we might think it's relatively comfortable, but the air temperature is 110 Fahrenheit. And in terms of what the subject feels like when they hit the water, that's the same as being in 70 Fahrenheit air temperature and 35 water temperature. So that definitely can lead to having a cold shock response, even though the water is relatively warm.
Yeah, thank you. And last question. You were talking a little bit about training, and I was wondering how socialized that we can make ourselves if we are in an area that's generally water under 70 degrees, whether in controlled environments, spending time in the water with our standard sailing gear, if that makes it easier to control the gas reflex and reduces panic. Can you talk about that?
Sure, I think that it does. There have been research studies where people were repeatedly immersed in a swimming pool that was cold. I'm glad I wasn't the graduate student involved in that project, but somebody had to do it. There have been studies where people were repeatedly immersed wearing different types of clothing, and I think the goal is to make sure that if you're doing that, you're doing it in a very controlled environment. It does two things. Hopefully it does reduce your panic when you hit the water, and second, it gives you an awareness of what's going on. If you think that you're going to swim the same way you would in a bathing suit as you would in full foul weather gear, you need to go swim in your full foul weather gear because you're gonna find it much more difficult. I do a lot of swimming in a dry suit, and it's completely different. Even though the dry suit fits well, it's comfortable, it allows a lot of mobility, it's still a lot more material than a bathing suit. So training with your equipment is critical. So after you've gone through the cold shock response and you're now at the surface, you've calmed down a little bit, the next phase is to take critical survival steps as soon as possible and self-rescue to the extent possible. While we're doing that, we want to avoid thrashing around. Instead, you want to move purposefully because that will help reduce heat loss. But we also want to recognize that every situation is different. So as a river paddler, my default might be to swim to shore. But if I'm out with Rich on a sailboat 20 miles offshore, swimming to shore is just not going to happen. So we need to be very aware of the situation and make good judgment based on what's going on. That might mean securing your life jacket so that later on it's going to stay on you well. It might be activating a personal locator beacon or using a communication system, a radio or cell phone to call for help. If the boat is capsized and you can't right it, it might mean climbing out onto the deck of the boat. It might mean securing your survival suit. It might mean roping people together so that you're in a big mass. Whatever you do, you want to do the most critical things first and then keep moving down the list until you are no longer able to help yourself.
And at what water temperature do you think sort of separates sailors from the use of wetsuits versus semi-dry suits versus dry suits? What when do you need one or the other to keep yourself safe?
Right. So, I think the rule of thumb of thinking about putting on thermal protection is anytime the water is 70 degrees Fahrenheit or less is a good starting point. I'm certainly not going to suggest you wear a 7mm wetsuit or a full dry suit every time you're out in 68 Fahrenheit water and 80 degree Fahrenheit air temperatures. That's just not reasonable and probably not needed. So part of it is recognizing what works for you and going out and trying the equipment and finding what you need to stay warm. Part of it is assessing the likelihood that you're going to enter the water. So if I'm on a cruise ship, 500,000-foot long vessel, I'm not worried about entering the water. It's very unlikely to happen. It's not something I need to plan for. If I'm in a 7-foot kayak in ocean surf or on a river, I pretty much can be guaranteed that I'm going to capsize and need to roll. I'm going to be immersed by spray. So I need to look at those conditions and kind of plan accordingly. I would say that as I've gotten older, I've gone to a dry suit more and more often, and I've never regretted that. It's certainly a lot more comfortable when I'm in the water. Teaching rescue classes, we're in the water quite a bit, and we want to be comfortable for that. But even paddling, wearing a dry suit with just a lightweight insulation under it seems to be very comfortable. So that's a long way of saying it all depends. I would say that by the time the water temperature is 60 Fahrenheit, I'm very strongly considering wearing either a wetsuit or a dry suit. And by the time it gets down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to be wearing a dry suit if there's any likelihood at all that I'm going to be in the water.
Thank you.
So as we move through cold incapacitation, or through the response after cold shock response and move towards cold incapacitation, you're going to lose coordination and strength. And our goal there, because we're no longer able to help ourselves, is to conserve heat as much as possible. And two ways that are taught are the help and the huddle position. These are sometimes taught as default things to go to, and I would argue that that's not necessarily correct. We definitely want to take all the self-rescue steps that we can take before we go into the help and huddle position, because once you're in these positions, you're pretty much committed to letting somebody else rescue you. So if I'm out on a boat and I fall overboard and I see that the boat is already tacking to come back to me, sure, I'll go into a help position because I'm just going to wait for them to come get me. But if I'm out on a boat by myself and I capsize, I need to be thinking about getting the boat right up instead of getting into a help position and assuming that somebody somewhere is eventually going to help me. So we'll take a look at the help position first. That's the heat escape lessening position. And essentially all we do is tuck our knees up to our chest, hold on tight, and try to share leg heat into our chest. This looks easy, except for the gentleman that's pictured here grimacing. It's interesting to practice it. It's much harder to do when you're very cold. You lose finger strength to hold your arms together. And depending on your body composition, you may not float in a great position. As an example, if I get into a help position with most life jackets that I own, I float almost face down. The weight of my legs pulls me forward, and my airway gets compromised pretty quickly. So this is something to practice before you need it. The second position is the huddle position, and that's exactly what it describes. You're huddling together as a group, sharing body heat. This has two advantages. First, because you are sharing body heat, you're likely to keep the group warmer. And then second, at this point, you're depending on somebody else to rescue you, so you are now a bigger target. Instead of, in this picture, 3 small individual targets, you have 1 larger target that is easier to find. So help and huddle are good positions. Just recognize that you're no longer doing self-rescue here. So ultimately, hypothermia, unconsciousness, and death are going to occur. The problem is that before unconsciousness, you've lost some motor control. So that means if there's any wave or ripples, any type of wind blowing spray, you're more likely to aspirate water. And that just emphasizes, again, having proper flotation to keep your head out of the water and proper thermal protection to keep you warm as long as possible is the way to go. And that brings us into the reality versus research. What happens if we're already cold and wet? Because a lot of the research is done with people who walk into a pool deck or start out on a pier relatively warm and then hop in the water. And if you've been out sailing all day or paddling all day, you've had cold spray onto you, you've had wind, you're wet, you're not at a normal body temperature. So the question is, how does that impact us? I would argue that it probably leads to a faster onset of cold incapacitation. If you capsize because your hands are so cold that you can no longer hold onto the main sheet, or your hands are so cold you can no longer hold onto your paddle, then you're well along the way into having problems. The reality is that you have a much lower self-rescue ability the colder that you are, and the research shows that cold water incapacitation is a real problem. The reality is that it's probably even worse than the research shows. So how do we prevent these problems? And the first one is just don't go in the cold water. We want to take steps to avoid capsize and fall overboard. So that means paying attention to weather and water conditions. If the weather is foul, it's probably time to stay home. When you're going out, boat under control so you're less likely to capsize, less likely to enter the water, and use protective equipment to stay aboard. You're going to feel fairly foolish if you have a harness below decks and you fall overboard and can't get back aboard. Having said all this, there's a challenge here because we all hopefully want to get better. We all want to push ourselves, and boating under safe conditions, controlled conditions all the time does not make us better boaters. So we want to balance the risk with the reward. If we're boating under control but pushing our limits, think about having some backup. So instead of going out and boating by yourself, have a couple people with you or another boat with you to help if something goes wrong, particularly in a small boat. If you're on a small dagger boat or centerboard boat, having a power boat nearby to help you, which is really what we hope to see in some type of program. We also want to pay attention when people swim. And the reality is that the first capsize or the first fall overboard might not be the problem. But the first time you capsize, you're a little bit cold, you're wet, you get your boat upright, you start sailing or paddling again, and then something happens and you capsize again. And that second event makes you even colder and wetter, and you've lost some finger strength because your fingers are cold. And that leads to the third event where now you're in the water, you're cold, you're well along the way to cold incapacitation, and you're no longer able to help yourself. So that means that for programs, we want to pay attention to when people start having trouble and, if necessary, change your programming. Bring people in earlier than you'd planned to, put people in different boats, change the crew members so that you're less likely to capsize, but really paying attention and taking steps proactively before somebody gets into trouble. And then the final thing is dressing to swim. Wear your life jacket. Every year, roughly 80% of boating fatalities are drowning, and roughly 80% of drowning subjects were not wearing a life jacket. The other people that drowned either had traumatic injuries or had entrapment, and that's certainly something we see in whitewater paddling where you're trapped against something holding you underwater, much less likely in a sailing environment. We want to wear proper clothing for the water temperatures, and we want to test your gear before you need it. And then definitely consider the situation. Because again, if you're on a cruise ship, that's a different environment than if you're on a 50-foot catamaran in the Caribbean versus you're on a 420 in San Francisco Bay. So pay attention to the situation. As the risk elevates, you want to take more aggressive steps to manage that risk. There are some options that we ought to mention, and when Rich and I talked about this, we discussed kind of the approach that paddlers use, and we can compare that to or at least offer that to sailors as something to try. So the ultimate in warmth is going to be a dry suit. Dry suits are waterproof and windproof. Most of them now are breathable, which makes them very comfortable. And you can vary the amount of insulation that's underneath of them, which allows you to work in a wide temperature range. The slide I showed at the beginning of the talk of the Swiftwater Rescue class, all of us had several layers of fleece on underneath. Class that I taught a few weeks ago, the air temperature was 80, water temperature was about 60, and most of us had dry suits and just silk weight polypro underneath, and we were quite comfortable. Dry suits, because they're waterproof, are perfect for frequent immersion. They're dry and waterproof because they have latex seals at the wrist and at the neck, and at the ankles they either have seals or integrated booties, so you stay very dry. But those latex seals can sometimes be a little tight and restricting, so some people find that semi-dry suits with neoprene gaskets rather than latex gaskets are more comfortable, just not as dry. Our next option is a wetsuit, and wetsuits come in varying weights from 0.5 millimeter up to 7 millimeters thick or even heavier. Obviously, the thicker it is, the warmer it is. And they provide varying coverage, from full wetsuits to a Farmer John wetsuit like this coverall. You can have shorty wetsuits, which are essentially a T-shirt and shorts, and you can get pants and tops and such. They provide padding, which as a paddler is important. If I'm bouncing over rocks, I like to know that. But if I'm also sitting down on a boat, as I'm sailing, it's nice to have a little bit of protection. They also provide extra flotation, which is always nice to have. For them to work properly, though, they do have to be form-fitting, which makes them a little snug, and some people find that uncomfortable. And they also provide less wind protection, less convective heat loss protection than dry suits do. And then the third option is splash gear, which is essentially lightweight foul weather gear. Again, you can vary the amount of insulation under them based on the conditions. Certainly not as warm as a wetsuit or a dry suit if they're worn by themselves, but they're a nice thing to add into different systems. So I could take splash gear, put it over a wetsuit to provide better thermal insulation, better protection from convective heat loss. If I'm in a relatively warm environment with just a little bit of wind, it's unlikely that I'm going to capsize, and the water temperature is relatively warm, I might just use splash gear. Same as if I'm on a sailboat, I'd use a foul weather jacket. So we've gone through what we do with cold shock response, cold incapacitation, and hypothermia. The last thing to think about is rendering aid for ourselves and others. So we want to think about, if you go into the water, can you get back aboard your vessel, or can you get back to some safe and warm place? As I said, as a river paddler, going to shore is always an option, but sometimes that's hard to do. As a sailor, if I capsize on a small boat, I'm going to right the boat, but again, sometimes you can't do that. So we need to think about what we're going to do once we're in the water. If we're part of a team, either multiple people on a boat or multiple people in small boats, we want to think about, can we get somebody else back aboard their vessel or get them to a safe, warm place? And particularly if you're part of the crew, can you manage the vessel without the help of the person that fell overboard? It'd be really embarrassing for the vessel to sail on because nobody else knew how to sail rather than the captain that fell overboard. You also want to know how to signal for help. And you may be able to get to the person but not be able to get them back on board. It'd be nice to be able to signal for help and get somebody out there to help you. And then can you provide appropriate first aid once that subject is back up on the vessel or back to shore and back to safety? And again, a wilderness first aid course is the appropriate thing to take for that.
Robin, that's great. I've heard conflicting opinions about this. Can you give someone hot drinks to help warm them up if you've rendered aid and they're suffering from cold water immersion or even hypothermia?
Let me give you a definite maybe. So our general rule of thumb is that if someone is alert and oriented, they can talk to you, they're able to discuss what's going on, they're not lethargic, they're not confused, then it's okay to give them something hot to drink, and that can help with their warming process. If there's any question about their ability to manage their airway, so if they're lethargic, they're confused or unconscious, then we want to avoid that. Even if I am going to give somebody hot drinks, I wouldn't put that as my top priority. Instead, I'd be thinking about getting them into a warm place, if possible, getting them in dry clothes, if not, certainly getting more clothes onto them, trying to shelter them from wind, and if I have heat packs, trying to apply that to their core to warm up their major organs. After I had done all of that, then I might think about hot drinks if I happen to have them. So some take-home messages that I hope you have. First, cold water isn't very cold. It's 70 degrees Fahrenheit or less. The colder it gets, the higher the risk, but there is risk in what we think is relatively warm water. Cold shock occurs in the first few minutes of a cold water exposure, causing gasping and panic. After that gasping and panic subside, we have an opportunity to take care of ourselves and do critical self-rescue opportunities. But eventually we're going to lead to cold incapacitation as our extremities cool down. That leads to swim failure. If you don't have flotation at that point, you're going to drown. And certainly during the cold shock phase, if you didn't have flotation, you weren't able to get to the surface, you have an increased risk of drowning. And then hypothermia will eventually happen, but it can take an hour or more to lead to unconsciousness, which means that we shouldn't give up on these victims. We should make every effort to get the person out of the water. Even when they seem lethargic or even unconscious, there's still an opportunity to save them if we take it aggressively and do everything in our power to help them. We definitely want to prevent the problems because they can happen to any of us. Any boater that thinks they will never go in the water is asking for a surprise. As a paddler, we tell people that we're really not boaters. We're swimmers that periodically sit in boats, and we want to take that attitude. There is always an opportunity to go overboard. So don't capsize, but be prepared for it to happen. Dress to swim for the water protection, for the water conditions rather. That includes your thermal protection and flotation, because neither one of those do any good if you're not wearing them. And then finally, know how to respond to the medical problems that this creates. There's some resources that people may enjoy. The Advanced Wilderness Life Support Program at alls.org has an article on surviving cold water immersion, provides a little bit more medical background than what I have. Dr. Giesbrecht's Cold Water Boot Camp has videos that describe all of these phases. And then there's a YouTube video by Dr. Giesbrecht that shows him discussing the 4 phases of cold water response, including circumrescue collapse. I mean, that's an educational video if you want to take a look at it. And I'll answer any questions. I will say that when this presentation goes onto the Starboard portal, I also have a number of research articles for anybody that is interested on them. So thank you for your attention. Be happy to answer questions. And I'm going to come off screen.
All right, thank you, Robin. If anybody has questions, feel free to drop them into the YouTube chat box. It's been a lot of information to digest and really, really valuable. First, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise here. Robin, can you talk a little bit about, as sort of a personal background, how did you get involved with cold water immersion? How did you gain an interest in this particular topic? I'm curious on the backstory.
Sure. So as a paddler and swiftwater rescue instructor, I spend a lot of time in the water. And particularly with swiftwater rescue in the mountains of North Carolina, we start teaching in typically April. Water temperatures are quite cold, air temperatures are quite cold, and reading about the thought that hypothermia was the major issue really didn't jive with what we were seeing. We've watched people that started rafting early fall in the water and have a sudden gasp and they get into trouble. At the same time, the American Canoe Association's Cold Water Survival Guide was not up to date, and a number of people were asking questions about what it said versus what the research said, and that led to me being much more interested into it and trying to look at the research and know what the research actually says.
And it's interesting, when we were having the walkthrough in this before, we were talking about Dr. Giesbrecht, and one of the things that I mentioned is as we developed our U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea course and our Safety at Sea guide, Dr. Giesbrecht had actually contributed some content to that as well, which was really helpful and appreciated. So it's interesting and fascinating to look at how topics can travel from paddle sports to sailing very easily.
And I think the reality is that we are all boaters, and whether we're in a power boat, a sailboat, a paddle craft, or anything else that's afloat, if we all have the same goal of going out and having fun on the water, it doesn't really matter what the boat is. It matters that we're all boaters.
Absolutely.
Hi, this is Rich, and one thing that I'd encourage or invite the audience to do is consider sharing whether you've experienced cold water shock or cold water incapacitation, just so that we have a general sense. You can just say yes to cold water shock, no to cold water incapacitation. It would be great for us to gather the experiences of all of you.
Yep, and Rich, something that we can do is we can carry this over into the Sailing Leadership Forum on Facebook, the group that's got several hundred people, and I'll make sure that we contribute your presentation to there as well, Robin, so we can continue the conversation post this.
And Rich, when you and I were talking about this before today, we talked about some of my experience with cold water shock, working as a lifeguard and training professional lifeguards in a mountain lake, and having a lifeguard student who was very familiar with the lake, who had trained in there before, but was just having a bad day. And when she jumped into the water, she had the sudden gasping, the sudden panic, and if we had not had somebody right there to help her, she might have gone underwater. Now, fortunately, there were other lifeguards right there. She was right next to the pier. We got her out. But it was interesting to really highlight that we can't guarantee that what we do today is going to reflect what happens tomorrow, because the day before she was able to get in and swim without any trouble. The day after she was able to, just that day she had a lot of trouble.
Yeah, so a little worrisome to hear it described that way.
And that's why we want to prepare for it. It's better to be prepared and not need it than to wish we had it.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I want to thank you again both for contributing your time and your expertise. For anybody who's watching at home that wants to go back and review this, it will be on the Starboard portal along with other presentations and US Sailing continuing to put out content through the rest of this week and beyond. Again, your membership dollars make this possible and these series of videos possible. So thank you to those of you that have contributed and continue to support US Sailing. Also, just a quick thank you to the American Canoe Association for helping to promote this. And Rob and Rich, thank you guys. This has been great, and appreciate your time.
Our pleasure.